All right, unclassified, committee sensitive, executive session, permanent select committees on intelligence, U.S. House of Representatives, Washington, D.C., interview of Rick A. Dearborn, Wednesday, January 17th, 2018, Washington, D.C. The interview in the above matter was held in room HVC 304, the Capitol, commencing at 11:01 a.m. Present, Representatives Conway, King, Lobiondo, Ross Lettinen, Wenstrup, Stewart of Utah, Gowdy, Stefanik, Himes, Sewell, Speyer, Quigley, Swalwell, Castro, and Heck. Appearances. For the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, for Rick Dearborn, William F. Caulfield, Esquire, Berliner, Corcoran and Howe, LLP, 1101 17th Street, NW, Suite 1100, Washington, D.C., 20036-4798. Good morning. This is the committee's interview of Rick Dearborn. Thank you for speaking with us today. Just a reminder to ensure everyone has left all electronic devices outside, to include phones, iPads, Blackberries, Fitbits, anything that transmits. For the record, my name is... I'm a staff member for the majority in the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Also present today are committee staff and members who will introduce themselves as these proceedings get underway. Before we begin, I wanted to state a few things for the record. The questioning will be conducted by committee members and staff. During the course of this interview, each side may ask questions during their allotted time period. Some of the questions may seem basic, but that is because we need to clearly understand the facts and understand the situation. Please do not assume we know any facts that you have previously disclosed as part of any other investigation or review. This interview will be conducted at the unclassified level. During the course of the interview, we will take any breaks that you desire. We ask that you give complete and fulsome replies to questions based on your best recollection. If a question is unclear or you are uncertain in your response, please let us know. If you do not know the answer to a question or cannot remember, simply say so. You are entitled to have counsel present with you during this interview, and I see that you do. At this time, if counsel could please state his name for the record. Mr. Caulfield. Bill Caulfield with Berliner, Corcoran, and Rowe. Blank. Thank you. The interview will be transcribed. As you can see, there is a reporter making a record of the proceedings, so we can easily consult a written compilation of your answers. Because the reporter cannot record gestures, we ask that you answer all questions verbally. If you forget to do this, you may be reminded. You may also be asked to spell certain names or unusual phrases. Consistent with the committee's rules of procedure, you and your counsel, upon request, will have a reasonable opportunity to inspect the transcript of the interview in order to determine whether your answers were correctly transcribed. The transcript will remain in the committee's custody, and the committee also reserves the right to request your return for additional questions should the need arise. The process for the interview will be as follows. The minority will be given 45 minutes to ask questions. Then the majority will be given 45 minutes to ask questions. Immediately thereafter, we will take a 5-minute break if you so choose, after which time the minority will be given 15 minutes to ask questions. The majority will be given 15 minutes to ask questions, and we will continue to alternate until the questions have been exhausted. The time limit will be adhered to by all sides, and the time will be kept, with 5-minute and 1-minute warnings given, respectively. To ensure confidentiality, we ask that you do not discuss the interview with anybody other than your attorney. You are reminded that it is unlawful to deliberately provide false information to members of Congress or their staffs. Mr. Dearborn, would you please raise your right hand to be sworn? Do you swear or affirm the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Mr. Dearborn, I do. Blank. Let the record reflect the witness has been sworn. Chairman Conway. Mr. Conway, Mr. Dearborn, thank you for coming in. Do you have any opening statement or anything? Mr. Dearborn, no, sir. Mr. Conway, Mr. Schiff, anything? Mr. Schiff, no, welcome. Appreciate you coming in. Mr. Conway, you guys are recognized for 45 minutes. Mr. Schiff, Mr. Swalwell. Okay, Mr. Swalwell. Good morning, Mr. Dearborn. Mr. Dearborn, good morning. Mr. Swalwell, thanks for coming in. Mr. Dearborn, how did you come to choose your counsel for matters pertaining to the Russia investigation? Mr. Dearborn, through a friend. Mr. Swalwell, who is that? Mr. Dearborn, Bill McGinley, a friend of mine. Mr. Swalwell, and to your knowledge, is your counsel representing any other individuals connected to a congressional Russia investigation or the special counsel's investigation? Mr. Dearborn, not to my knowledge. Mr. Swalwell, and Mr. Dearborn, we did receive from you, and we appreciate you responding to the request for discovery, correspondence that you had during the campaign. 123 pages of documents. Did you ever use any personal email accounts or personal cell phones to conduct any work for the campaign? Mr. Dearborn, it would not have been reflected in the documents that I provided you. Mr. Swalwell, and if we come across anything during our questions today, can you follow up with anything that may be relevant? Mr. Dearborn, absolutely, sure. Mr. Swalwell, have you been interviewed by special counsel's office with respect to this investigation? Mr. Dearborn, I have. Mr. Swalwell, when was that? Mr. Caulfield, about 6 weeks ago. Mr. Swalwell, and any other congressional committees? Mr. Dearborn, the Senate Intel Committee. Mr. Swalwell, Mr. Dearborn, how did you come to work for Senator Sessions? Mr. Dearborn, I started with Senator Sessions in 1996, December. He hired me on his birthday, which is December 24th, and started with him on January 3rd. So I'd worked in the Senate prior. Through friends, had found out about an opening for a legislative director position and interviewed for it, and he hired me. Mr. Swalwell, when did you become Chief of Staff? Mr. Dearborn, that was after I returned from the Department of Energy. I was his legislative director up until 2003. From 2003 to 2005, I was the Assistant Secretary for Congressional Affairs at Department of Energy underneath the Bush administration. and the chief of staff in Senator Sessions' office was leaving at the end of 2004, and he reached out. And, like many of you, when you were called back to serve your boss, you go back and serve your boss. Mr. Swalwell, so after you were called back to serve your boss, did you remain as chief of staff up until when Donald Trump was elected president? Mr. Dearborn, I was chief of staff until 12 p.m., January 20th of 2017. Mr. Swalwell, did you ever do any campaign work for Senator Sessions during any of those times? Mr. Dearborn, sure. Mr. Swalwell, okay, can you just briefly describe for us when that was and what it looked like? Mr. Dearborn, his re-elect in 2008. His re-elect, I guess, that would have been in 2014. Mr. Swalwell, and remind me, I don't recall, were those contested? I know 2014. Mr. Dearborn, that was my favorite one. Mr. Swalwell, yeah? No Democrat, right? Mr. Dearborn, yeah, I didn't do a lot of work in 2014. Mr. Swalwell, in 2008, was that a contested? Mr. Dearborn, it was. Vivian Figures ran against him in 2008. Mr. Swalwell, and what was your role in the campaign then? Mr. Dearborn, yeah, because 2003 was Susan Parker. Mr. Swalwell, what was your role in the 2008 race? Mr. Dearborn, I volunteered my time. I wasn't the campaign manager or anything in 2008. Mr. Swalwell, okay, how did it come about that you joined the Trump campaign? Mr. Dearborn, Senator Sessions and the then businessman Donald Trump had met years ago, talking about the remodeling of the UN, and it was a fun exchange for both of them. They developed kind of a relationship. Mr. Swalwell, when was that? Mr. Dearborn, gosh, it was. Sessions and Coburn were both focused on that. It was. They were looking to rebuild the UN up in New York for $1 trillion. Then Mr. Trump came to testify and said that he could build it for maybe a quarter or half the price. Gosh, I just don't remember. I think I was still legislative director, so it would have been maybe in the early 2000s. Mr. Swalwell, did they stay in contact throughout that period? Mr. Dearborn, not really. I mean, they had a great exchange. They didn't talk on any kind of regular basis. And then, I think, as Mr. Trump was engaging in the campaign, a lot of the issues that he was talking about early on, I think, sparked the interest of Senator Sessions. And so that then kind of reacquainted them, and they talked a little bit more often. And then candidate Trump would come and would visit with the senator a couple of times to talk about policy. Mr. Swalwell, do you remember how the first approach worked? Mr. Dearborn, Peggy, can you get Donald Trump on the phone? I want to talk to him about immigration and trade. Mr. Swalwell, okay, so Donald Trump is a candidate for president and your boss. Senator Sessions made the initial approach to talk to him. Mr. Dearborn, I think he made the initial approach. If then candidate Trump made the initial approach, it's possible that he did, based on Senate floor speeches, and I think probably the positions that Senator Sessions had been taking at the time. Mr. Swalwell, and when? Mr. Dearborn, so I just want to be clear. I'm not sure if he called but I think he called. Mr. Swalwell, when did you first become involved? Mr. Dearborn, I first became involved probably in early 2016 after the senator endorsed candidate Trump. Mr. Swalwell. He was the first senator to endorse him. Is that right? Mr. Dearborn. Correct. Mr. Swalwell. And what did your involvement look like? Mr. Dearborn. I was asked to join the campaign full time. I told him I couldn't do that. I was chief of staff for a U.S. senator. But I'd be happy to volunteer my time. So I called up the Senate Ethics Committee and kind of walked through what I needed to do and make sure I was all buttoned up on how I would do that. So lunch hours, after work, before work, I could take vacation days. So I did all of that and just made sure I did it by the book. Mr. Swalwell. And were you ever paid by the Trump campaign? Mr. Dearborn. I was. Mr. Swalwell. Okay, and when did that start? Mr. Dearborn. It was the payment. I don't know if the payment came on a monthly basis or if it was one. It may have been one lump check. But again, I checked with the Ethics Committee to find out what was the amount of outside income I could make. And I wanted to make sure that, that they could pay me. But I wanted to make sure it was all buttoned up. Mr. Swalwell. What was the amount? Mr. Dearborn. Like $26,000. Mr. Swalwell. Yeah, I think that's about the limit. Mr. Dearborn. It was right below the limit. Yeah. Mr. Swalwell. What did you understand your role would be in the campaign? Mr. Dearborn. The then candidate Trump didn't have a D.C. presence, and so they asked me to kind of help set up a Washington office to reach out to other members of Congress on the Republican side of the aisle, Democrats if they were interested in joining the campaign, and to go meet with House members and senators, and then a small policy shop. But the predominant number of people that worked there were all volunteer. Mr. Swalwell. Where did you create that office? Mr. Dearborn. It was in Alexandria, Virginia. Mr. Swalwell. And was that at your initiative? Mr. Dearborn. I was asked to do it. I think the office space wasn't something that I went and rented. It was kind of all arranged through the campaign. Mr. Swalwell. And who worked out of the Virginia office? Mr. Dearborn. I did on my volunteer time. A small number of policy team members. I can try to list as many names as you'd like me to. Mr. Swalwell. Sure. Just who you recall. Mr. Dearborn. John Mashburn was kind of our policy director. We had Katie Talinto, Ph. Then a lot of people just volunteered their time. They had other jobs, but they would come in when they could. Let's see. Blank, 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 blank was a young intern in the office, and blank, she was an assistant. Mr. Swalwell, what was your title? Mr. Dearborn, just director of Washington office. I don't even think I got business cards, so I don't really throw a title around or anything. Mr. Swalwell, when did you first meet Donald Trump as candidate Trump? Mr. Dearborn, probably during several of the meetings that we had at the end of 2015, whenever he would come to the Hill, kind of towards the end of 2015, September, October, November. Mr. Swalwell, where would those meetings be? Mr. Dearborn, there were a couple in the senator's hideaway inside the Capitol, but in the Senate office or inside the Capitol. I think there were a couple at both places. Mr. Swalwell, were they campaign meetings? Mr. Dearborn, no, we were talking about issues. Mr. Swalwell, and at this point, Senator Sessions had not endorsed. Is that right? Mr. Dearborn, right. Mr. Swalwell, would you ever speak directly with Donald Trump during the campaign? Mr. Dearborn, during the campaign itself? Mr. Swalwell, yes. Mr. Dearborn, not really. How are you, sir? Nice to meet you. Mr. Swalwell, how about by telephone? Mr. Dearborn, no. Mr. Swalwell, were you familiar with how individuals who did need to speak with candidate Trump would reach him if they wanted to reach him by telephone? Mr. Dearborn, I'd be guessing. Mr. Swalwell, if you ever needed to connect Senator Sessions to him, how would you do it? Mr. Dearborn, probably through Rhonda. I would assume at the time she was in Trump Tower with him. I mean, that's just my guess, though. I never did that. The senator would probably have asked Peggy Hanrahan to connect him, and I'm sure that she would have called Rhonda at that time. Mr. Swalwell, from your observation, was Rhonda the person closest to candidate Trump who could reach him and put him in touch with whoever was trying to get hold of him? Mr. Dearborn, well, she could shout from the other room. Mr. Swalwell, they were that close? Mr. Dearborn, yeah. Mr. Swalwell, did you ever go to Trump Tower? Mr. Dearborn, sure, I worked there during the transition. Mr. Swalwell, and you observed Rhonda being that close? Mr. Dearborn, I met with her several times. Questions that she had, we try to answer that, whatever question she had. Mr. Swalwell, did she occur to you to be somebody who had deep knowledge of the president's decades-long business and professional and political contacts?